Association American Branch committees, namely the Committee on Teaching International Law, which Professor Michael Scharf from New England School of Law and I co-chair. Professor Scharf is speaking right now on another panel, and it was one of these things that if we wanted to get panelists who are here today, we had to do it at this time, etc., etc. You understand the problems with scheduling, so that's where we are. In fact, Michael Scharf and Professor John King Gamble from Pennsylvania State University and I are also members of the ILA International Committee on Teaching International Law, which is chaired by Professor Hilary Charlesworth from Adelaide University in Australia. I only mention these things in passing, as it were, because I think particularly for new members of the International Law Association, they're not really quite certain how the International Law Association works. They know it has this conference every year, but what distinguishes the ILA from other organizations is that we operate by means of committees, both national and international, and hopefully produce scholarly works on international law that are useful to everyone. So I just wanted to explain to people who didn't know how the ILA works differently from other organizations how it does. 2 years ago, Michael Scharf and I decided it would be a good idea to present a panel on some aspect of teaching international law at the ILA weekend. The first year we presented a panel on internationalizing the law school curriculum. And last year, the panel consisted of 4 law professors who ran international law clinics at their law schools. They shared with us their experiences in establishing and running these clinics that offer students hands-on, practical international law work. This year, we decided to look at a particular subject of international law, namely the laws of war, and discuss its teaching in the law schools and other institutions. You can guess from the title of this panel, Teaching the Laws of War, much too important to be left to the military academies, that Professor Scharf and I had a certain agenda in mind in constituting this panel. What we have observed over the course of our law school teaching career is that very few law schools teach a course on the laws of war, though generally the military academies do teach such courses. We have concluded that this dearth of courses is not good for the law schools, not good for students, not good for the general public, and not good for national or global society. That is quite a claim. And what is our gripe? Now, before I explain what our gripe is, let me just say that I, along with a number of you, were at the earlier panel that has just finished now on developments in humanitarian law, and I was quite struck by the fact that 2 of the panelists mentioned the same problem, namely the problem of not enough information about the laws of war generally. One spoke about it in the context of the general public not knowing about the laws of war, and one spoke about it in the context of the media not knowing enough about the laws of war. And both of them seem to have begun little activities, and some of them large activities, to try and redress this lack of information. And I suppose this panel is another cry for more information in a particular locality, namely law schools. So what is our gripe? And how did we arrive at our discontent? Let me address the second question first. How did I become aware of and uneasy about the state of teaching the laws of war? In 1997, I attended Virginia Law School's annual National Security Law Summer Institute. And in the audience, I see a fellow student of mine.
I forgot my souvenir hat. I would have worn it by now.
Right. Which is principally run by Professors John Morton Moore and Robert Turner from the University of Virginia Law School. The group attending the institute is mainly drawn from military lawyers in the 3 or 4 branches of the military services, and often they are high-ranking officers with many years of experiences in the JAG corps to which they are attached. There were also a few political science academics and a few law professors, and a few others. At the Institute, we studied a number of topics relating to national security, both from the national and international perspective, including extensive materials on the Vietnam War. The laws of war were an integral part of the Institute's program. Almost all of the presenters were knowledgeable and good lecturers. Many of them came from military academies or JAG corps. Though I had long had an interest in national security law and the laws of war, I had never studied them in depth and had come to the Institute to learn. It was very clear to me after a few hours of instruction that the JAG Corps and military lawyers who made up the majority of my fellow students were a very different breed from the few law school and political science academics and the smattering of other lawyers. The military lawyers were bright, well-informed, indeed knew far more than I did on the subject, hard-working and attentive, but they seemed to have lost the ability to do two crucial things. First, they never questioned the basic premises upon which an argument was constructed. They would ask what I came to think of as polite, tinkering at the edges questions, such as, I wonder if you could explain in a little more detail the reasons why the US needed to rescue our citizens from Grenada, sir. And everything, when the military address each other, it's quite marked, everybody's sir or ma'am, hesitating again, it's not very polite. The second task these lawyers seemed unable to perform was the ability to place the topic under discussion, such as the US entry into Grenada, in any larger context, such as if the discussion was the justification of US entry into Grenada, there would tend to be long discussions on factual questions, such as how many medical students were there, or did the medical students request rescue, etc., rather than any focus on the overall prohibitions on the use of force, or the rules of non-intervention, or the general interstate international system. After a day of keeping relatively quiet, some of us in the minority began to recognize that we had similar criticisms of the dominant approach, and we started to form a position of which Kevin McMillan was a stalwart member. We questioned the premises, we disagreed with the premises, and we started setting a particular in the larger framework. We would not appreciate it at first, but a very remarkable change took place over the course of the 2 weeks at the Institute. Gradually, some of the younger military lawyers began to realize that they were allowed to question the premises. Indeed, they were allowed to understand the premises, and did so, and the methodology began to catch on. By the end of our time together, we were a very bonded group who were probably the most challenging students that the presenters had ever faced. After I returned to Boston, I began to think about this experience, and in particular what it might mean in light of the knowledge that there are very few civilian-trained lawyers who ever learn about the laws of war. It seemed to me that we needed a mission to expand the number of courses offered in this area. The laws of war do find their way into law school curricula, but only very briefly. The introductory course on public international law will generally have a week or two of the syllabus addressing aspects of the laws of war, usually nothing more than a careful parsing of Articles 24 and 51 of the UN Charter, with perhaps some discussion of the Nicaragua case and latterly the nuclear weapons case. Professor John King Gamble from Pennsylvania State University has written a book entitled Teaching International Law in the 1990s that was published in 1992 by the American Society of International Law, where he presents the results of his empirical study of the courses offered in international law in both Canada and the United States at both the law school and the undergraduate level. What he found was there were almost no courses specifically on the laws of war being taught in the law schools or political science departments. Those findings were based on data collected in 1990 to 1991, and I know of no survey since then on the subject, but I have no reason to think that the picture has changed much. A number of courses courses have cropped up on international criminal law, and those courses do contain sections on the laws of war. A number of law schools teach a course on national security law, and there are two major, maybe three major texts in the area. One text by Moore, Tipson and Turner from Virginia, and a second edition of text by Dykers, Burney, Banks and Braden Hanson. But those books focus primarily on US law and the constitutional division of powers over national security issues. The Moore, Tipson, Turner book does have more to offer in international aspects of law to war, but is now 10 years old, and the authors are not planning a new edition. At the moment, there are numerous political science treatises on the laws of war, but no casebook or collection of useful teaching materials, at least not that I know of. It is hoped that by bringing this dangerous deficit to the Academy's attention, we will have begun the walk towards reform and more information. Let me just end up my introductory remarks by talking about a particular example of the lack of information. The NATO invasion of Yugoslavia produced a plethora of media discussion, but at the time there was hardly any discussion of whether such an invasion was permissible under the laws of war, or two, whether the conduct of the hostilities complied with international law. Indeed, the State Department never issued a statement containing a legal justification for the invasion, and I don't think they have done so to date. After the conflict was over, some academics weighed in on the question as to the laws of war and its application in NATO. Indeed, the American Journal of International Law produced a very useful collection of articles on the subject. I remain convinced that if the laws of war were taught more widely in law schools, the decision-making on the use of force and the dialogue about armed conflict would firstly take place, and secondly, be at a much better informed level. Today we begin by taking the first step by asking three experts in the area to share with us their experiences of teaching the laws of the war and giving their perspective on what can be done to improve the glaring gap in our law schools course offerings. The panelists today are some of the most distinguished academics in the fields of the laws of war. I will go along from my far right. Professor Alfred Rubin is a professor at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University and the president of the American branch of the International Law Association. As he says, for the next 3 or 4 hours, he is staying after a very distinguished number of years being our president here. Professor Ivan Shearer is Stockton Professor of International Law at the U.S. Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island, where he is visiting for the year from his usual professorship at the University of Sydney, Australia. He has recently been elected a member of the United Nations Human Rights Committee. Professor Theodore Narron is professor at New York University Law School of International Law and is also a counselor on international law at the United States Department of State. He is also a supervisor and a member of the steering committee on the ICRC study of the rules of international humanitarian law, which he tells me will be published in 2001, which we are all eagerly awaiting. All three of them have written extensively on the laws of war and more generally upon international law, and have held many prestigious academic and professional positions. They have also taught the laws of war in a variety of settings, and I will call upon Professor Theodore Narron to go first.
Thank you. I'm really grateful to Professor Barry Epps for organizing this panel and for inviting me to participate in it. And I particularly congratulate her on this important initiative of proposing this question of teaching of law, war, or international humanitarian law in non-military universities as a discrete topic for this meeting of the ILA. By doing so, she's helping to draw attention to an area which until very recently has been one of terrible neglect. Even now it is disconcerting to reflect on how few universities, in fact, have any programs of teaching of law. It is easy to understand why in the years following the establishment of the United Nations, with its categorical prohibitions on the use of force and resort to war, except in self-defense or otherwise in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations, many academics thought that war and the laws of war were becoming moot or obsolete, and that as an academic topic, law of war was increasingly esoteric. The people wanted wars to go away, and felt that by teaching laws of war, we would create the impression that wars were here to stay. But wars or armed conflict did not go away, and while the number of international wars has greatly declined, the number of non-international armed conflicts has grown exponentially. The report of the United Nations Secretary General on Human Rights, in armed conflict, which appeared in late 60s and early 70s, drew attention to this growing problem of international humanitarian law applicable to non-international conflicts, and the need to develop and to clarify. And accordingly, although he did not speak about the question of dissemination and teaching, to teach and disseminate knowledge of international humanitarian law. The International Committee of the Red Cross, of course, continued to draw attention to the acute relevance of those subjects, and it convened in the 70s diplomatic conferences in Geneva, which lasted some 4 years, and which resulted in the adoption of the 2 additional protocols to the Geneva Conventions, one on international and one on non-international armed conflict. And of course, we have constantly had also this separate non-ICRC process, the United Nations process dealing with the Convention on Conventional Weapons and the various protocols that over time have been adopted in that convention. And we have yet had a third process, the Ottawa process, which led to the adoption of the Convention on Anti-Personnel Landmines. And all of these developments, the conferences in the 1970s, the report of the Secretary General, the United Nations process of continuing work on conventional weapons, Conventional Weapons Convention and the various protocols, all of them have contributed to a growing public awareness of the importance of the subject. Still, even taking all of those factors into account, very few people have taught and are teaching law of war outside of military academies. And it was not until the beginning of the Yugoslav conflict in early 90s, in the well-publicized atrocities committed in Yugoslavia and subsequently in Rwanda, that attention has focused really in a very acute and intense way on international humanitarian law and on war crimes in particular, with the establishment of the 2 ad hoc tribunals in Yugoslavia and for Yugoslavia and for Rwanda, and the beginning of the work at that time on the establishment of a standing permanent international criminal court. Law of war became, humanitarian law became for the first time, I think, in the 90s, central to governments, central to policymakers, central to the media, central to the United Nations. In other words, outside of its habitual community of the ICRC, the circle of interested entities, with considerable political interest and political power is being increased. And international humanitarian law has, in terms of its intellectual content also changed or started changing its shape and form and dimensions. It became suddenly the cutting edge of public international law. These developments triggered the production of books, law review articles, and finally some courses offered in civilian law schools and civilian universities. However, most of these developments have narrowly focused on the law of, on the war crimes component of international humanitarian. There was until recently not a single general, easily available book, course book, as our chairperson has pointed out, on general international humanitarian law. There were books on war crimes, because that was the most trended, the most passionate, the most central topic of German interest. Now, the International Committee of the Red Cross was well aware of this situation and has tried to provide a remedy by organizing over the years in Geneva and the Graduate Institute of International Studies 3 seminars for university teachers focused exclusively on teaching of international humanitarian law in universities. These seminars were designed to promote, to encourage teaching of this subject by young teachers in the field. I was the academic director of those seminars, and I was encouraged by the commitment made by many young teachers to start teaching law in their universities. Yet, as one of the few instructors who has been involved in this field for at least 2 decades, I found the lack of easily available, affordable course book a very serious impediment to my teaching of international humanitarian law. And I found the need to prepare every year a set of my own materials extremely inconvenient, time-consuming, something that really was a major discouragement to the teaching of the subject. And I was already a person who was really very much involved in the field. Imagine the difficulties faced by people who are less familiar with international humanitarian law. For them, the lack of a course book was a real obstacle, more than a discouragement to structuring a course and teaching in this area. Now, nevertheless, recently we have seen some very important, positive, encouraging development. All those who already teach in this area and those who think of teaching it will welcome the appearance recently of a first major course book on international humanitarian law, one which is both comprehensive and affordable. I don't think I will get a commission from the representative of the ICRC here, but the course will cost $45, which is for a book which holds 1,200 pages. It's a reasonable price. And of course, I am referring to Marcus Sassoli's and Antoine Mouvier's book, How Does Law Protect War? Cases, Documents, and Teaching Materials, which was published in 1999 by the ICRC. And I would like to add to that an important tool which will greatly facilitate the teaching of international humanitarian law in addition to this course book is, of course, the study of customary rules of international humanitarian law, which will come up hopefully in 2000. This sort of a statement, and these could very well serve as companion volumes, and many of us who teach in the area of public international law have very often, for instance, used the restatement term of United States Foreign Relations Law as an almost companion volume to whatever other source we use. There is therefore room for optimism that this month's situation of neglect of law of war in civilian universities will soon change. So I would simply like to end with the hope that I do hope very strongly that this new emerging commitment to teaching of law, war, and humanitarian law will be lasting. and will persist even when, as we all hope, the care for bloody internal conflicts will start to decline, and this subject will perhaps be somewhat less fashionable than it is now. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor. I now turn to Professor Hyde.
Well, thank you for inviting me to contribute to this panel. At the beginning, I had an uneasy feeling about the title. What was it supposed to imply? Professor Epps has told us what her gripe is, and it appears to be that the laws of armed conflict are being taught in military academies separately from the right to resort to force. If we want to do it in Latin, we say it's the distinction between the jus in bello and the jus ad bellum. And it could be that some conferences or some courses are focused entirely on the latter, and that the jus ad bellum is part of the general course in international law. But I'll leave that aside for a moment. Some might wish to take that up in the discussion. For myself, the course that I teach at the University of Sydney is 50-50, jus ad bellum and jus in bello. But I could imagine courses, if there were a course in international humanitarian law as such, well then I think it would avoid questions such as, were we right to go into Grenada and so on, because they do belong to a separate book, as it were. I speak with some knowledge of the teaching of laws of armed conflict in both military settings and in the civilian law school settings, because I am a professor of international law at the University of Sydney, but also, as I've said, I'm currently teaching at the Naval War College. But before that, I admit to being a captain in the Royal Australian Navy Reserve, and I lecture regularly to military audiences, not only Navy, but also because Australian armed forces are increasingly integrated to Army and Air Force personnel as well. But first, I think I want to make one initial point, and that is to note the actual obligations of nations in the teaching of the laws of war, deriving from their treaty commitments. There are some, it was mentioned at this morning's panel, the 1949 Geneva Conventions are the most heavily subscribed conventions, I think, in existence. There are more parties to the Geneva Conventions than there are member states of the United Nations. A common article with minor variations in each of these four conventions says that the high contracting parties undertake, in time of peace as in time of war, to disseminate the text of the present convention as widely as possible in their respective countries, and in particular, to include the study thereof in their programs of military and, if possible, civil instruction, so that the principles thereof may become known to the entire population. Now, the Geneva Conventions relate to what is called, in its narrower sense, international humanitarian law. Additional Protocol 1 to the Geneva Conventions of 1977 brought that law, the international humanitarian law, the law of Geneva, together with the law of war, the law of the Hague Conventions 1907, so that the two branches, the two parallel branches, as it were, came together and began to flow in the same stream after 1977. To the extent that we now regard these expressions, the laws of war, the laws of armed conflict, international humanitarian law, they all go together, and any one of those terms embraces the others. I think that is now accepted in the literature and by the teachers of the subject. So in Protocol 1, Article 83, that therefore, and with that understanding, it brings together this obligation to disseminate to both the military part of society and to civilians in society, it makes this, I won't reread it because it uses the same words in 1949, but it now talks about encouraging dissemination of the protocol, which of course embraces the laws of war, more narrowly understood, as well as the international humanitarian law. The fact that the United States is not yet a party to Additional Protocol 1 is, I think, not relevant. As I understand it, the policy of the United States is to apply the protocol de facto wherever possible, especially in joint operations with other nations that are a party to it, and to accept most of its provisions as reflective of customary international law. Now, I turn to my own country, Australia, because that's the one that I know most about, how we go about teaching the laws of war in Australia. A major role is played in Australia in the field of education in the laws of armed conflict by the Red Cross movement. The work of the regional delegate of the International Committee of the Red Cross, based in Sydney, is almost entirely devoted to the dissemination of the Convention and the 2 additional protocols. He travels extensively throughout Australia, New Zealand and the Pacific Island countries. He meets with officials of the local defence ministries and with politicians. He also visits the universities. The National Association, the Australian Red Cross, although primarily concerned with disaster relief and the tracing of missing relatives, is also engaged in the work of making the conventions and protocols better known to the entire population. There is a dissemination committee in each of the states of Australia, in which there is a representative of each of the 3 armed forces, Navy, Army and Air Force, and also the universities. The Australian Red Cross sponsors periodic conferences on international humanitarian law, in which academics, journalists, the general public, uniformed military personnel and defence civilians take place. A recent and most notable initiative of the Australian Red Cross is the sponsorship of a Red Cross chair in international humanitarian law at the University of Melbourne. This is a continuing chair, not a short-term visiting post. The inaugural holder of the chair is Professor Timothy McCormack, whom some of you may know. There are elective courses in international humanitarian law or law of armed conflict offered in at least 4 Australian law schools. The University of Melbourne, my own university, the University of Sydney, the University of New South Wales and the Australian National University in Canberra. The Red Cross sponsors an essay competition for law students throughout Australia, whether they are enrolled in such an elective or not. There are also plans to conduct a national student moot court competition involving questions of international humanitarian law or law of armed conflict under the auspices of the Red Cross. So that's the universities. So far as military instruction is concerned, there are short courses or seminars in the area at each stage of the officer promotion process. Such courses are not confined to those who especially need them for their particular billets. The courses are conducted either by regular officers with appropriate academic qualifications, by reserve officers, like myself, who include a number of university law teachers, or by civilian experts. Exercises and war games always contain international law elements. Each of the 3 branches of the armed services has a manual of international law specific to their operations. Officers of the Australian Defence Force may be selected to attend courses run at San Remo, Italy, by the International Institute of Humanitarian Law. Selected senior legal officers specialising in international law may also attend a course at Cambridge University in England. And on exchange with the United States, many officers study courses or take higher degrees in international law at United States military academies. One should never be complacent, but I do believe that international humanitarian law and law of armed conflict training in the Australian Defence Force is on the right track. It may be that the isolation of Australia has the effect of making Australians more internationally minded. Certainly the prospect of attending a course or seminar at an overseas location helps to make the subject popular. I personally know 4 serving legal officers who have PhDs in international law, and many have master's qualifications or their equivalents. My only substantial criticism is that officers move billets too frequently, and that often their advanced expertise in IHL or law of armed conflict becomes dissipated. But I suppose this is inevitable in a force of such a small size. I have one final comment on Australia, and it's anecdotal, but I think it may have some resonance here, I wonder. I was once the presenter of an unclassified war game at a Navy seminar in which line officers, not just legal officers, were the participants. I decided to use the same scenario in playing a war game with a group of my own university students, my own course in international humanitarian law. Now, the general object of war games is to decide when deadly force will first be used. They are typically exercises using rules of engagement, in which the stated national objective is to contain, and if possible, de-escalate a situation of tension with another country. In other words, the motive is, if force is to be used, let it be the other side that uses it first. That's the approach. But of course, there are situations in which the use of force in anticipatory, or as Professor Denstein would prefer, interceptive self-defence must be considered. One does not have to accept the first casualties in order to be on the good side. Now, I have to report that the law students were far more eager to open fire first than were the naval officers. They were the Rambos, not the military people. And I'll leave you to speculate on the possible reasons for that in the discussion period. Now, I have a few brief comments, if I have time, on the United States. I haven't been here long enough to get the situation. I was very interested in what Professor Epps and Professor Meron have to say about the situation in this country. I've only been at the Naval War College for 3 months, but what I have seen and heard inclines me to believe that the teaching in the United States military academies is generally conducted at a very high level of both awareness and competence. And I may say that the US ADBEL is not lacking, at least at the Naval War College, and that's the only one that I can speak of. The chair that I occupy for this academic year 2000-2001, the Charles H. Stockton Chair of International Law, stands as an example of the infiltration, if you like, of civilian professors of international law into the curriculum of the college. Founded in 1951, the Stockton Chair has been occupied by a line of holders of recognised eminence in civilian academic life, although it is true that some of them have also had military experience. The inaugural holder of the chair was Judge Manly O. Hudson. He was followed by Hans Kelsen, Leo Gross, and other notable holders include Brunson McChesney, William T. Mallison Jr., Carl Crystal, Richard Lillick, Oliver Lysitzen, Fred Goldie, Howard Levy, Alwyn Freeman, our current ILA American Branch President Alfred Rubin, George Bunn, George Walker, Myra Nordquist, Leslie Green, Ruth Wedgwood, and most recently, Joram Dinstein. Each one of these names will, I'm sure, be familiar to this audience. The Department of Oceans Law and Policy at the college in which the Stockton Chair is situated, and whose mandate extends to the teaching of international humanitarian law and the law of armed conflict, is staffed with highly qualified and experienced serving and retired officers. All have law degrees and have participated in advanced courses. They include US Coast Guard and Marine Corps officers, as well as Navy. All are able to integrate their military training with their advanced legal knowledge and teaching skills. Now, this is a vital point. Teaching to military audiences lacks credibility unless scholarship and teaching are informed and focused through operational experience. This is the street cred factor, if you will. Essentially, it is to ensure the relevance of the teaching to the real world that the audience inhabits. The Naval War College has also contributed significantly to the fund of scholarship and dissemination of the laws of war through its well-known series of international law studies begun in 1901, known as Blue Books. They are to be found in all major libraries. There are now nearly 80 volumes of the series. The most recent are Howard Levy on the law of war, then a collection of essays on the law of armed conflict into the next millennium, the law of military operations, which is a Liber Amicorum of Professor Jack Grunewald, the annotated supplement to the Commander's Handbook on the law of naval operations, previously known as NWP 9. That is a book which is held by the leaders of virtually every other nation, and there's a standard work of reference, and it was very influential. For those of you who are familiar with the San Remo manual of international humanitarian law applicable to armed conflict at sea, they will see the influence of NWP 9 in that. There are 4 further volumes currently in press or nearing completion, since Professor Meron is advertising the RCRC work, so I'll give a plug for the Naval War College publications that you should be on the lookout for. The first is a study of the tanker war of 1980 to 88 between Iraq and Iran by Professor George Walker. A festschrift for Professor Leslie Green, which is just about to come out. Articles from a symposium held at the War College on computer network attack and international law. It's international law and information operations that is the next major field of study in the law of armed conflict. It can't be overemphasized how important computer networks are now to modern warfare. And finally, there will be a study of the forcible protection of nationals, that is humanitarian intervention. Now, I regard this as a quite outstanding body of work, and I'm happy to report that the Government Printing Office in the United States distributes free copies to most libraries and to law schools. Now, others here will be able to say how widely the subject is taught in American law schools, but for me, as from outside, judging from the periodical literature and the number of monographs on particular aspects, there is a very significant body of scholars contributing greatly to the development of this branch of the law. Not least of all Professor Meron with his study of Shakespeare and the laws of war, which he illustrated wonderfully written works. But one final observation I will make, and I should be very glad to be contradicted about it at this meeting, is that the American Red Cross does not seem to be as active relatively to the size of the population of the United States as is its Australian counterpart in the field of dissemination, and particularly in its interaction with the armed forces. I may be totally wrong, but there may be some reason for that. I just wonder whether there's anyone in this room who has connections with the American Red Cross who might like to take up that point during the discussion period. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Shearer. And if there is anyone with information on that subject, we'll deal with it in the Q&A session. I just did want to, when I heard about the book that Professor Meron mentioned, I immediately said to him, could he write it down? And I thought someone might want to know it. He didn't pick it up exactly. I think his writing is a little, somewhat difficult. I think it says Sassoli, is that right? S-A-S-S-O-L-I, and Bouvier.
Bouvier. B-O-U-V-I-E-R.
Oh, Bouvier. Bouvier.
That's in Jacqueline.
Yes, that's in Jacqueline, Bouvier Kennedy. Okay, Bouvier. How does law protect in war, cases, documents, and teaching materials published by the ICRC. In 1999.
One which I cannot read myself.
ICRC. Good. In 1999. That's a wonderful teaching thing to know about. Good. I am next going to call upon our illustrious president of the International Law Association, Alfred Rubin.
Let me immediately, not only disclaim illustriousness, but indicate, at least anecdotally, some of the reasons why I'm not, at least one of the reasons why I'm not, is Ivan was a captain in the Royal Australian Navy. I was Lieutenant JG in the American Navy when I left it. Eventually rising to the exalted rank of lieutenant in the American Navy before resigning. I would also confirm something that Ivan said. I worked for the Department of Defense for 6.5 years as a lawyer. And this was during the Vietnam days. In fact, I was the lawyer principally charged at a very junior level with our Vietnam entanglements from 1964 and 65, and can testify that we were not consulted on very much. I would say that my experience was, again, equivalent to Ivan's. State Department thought that a whiff of grape shot would solve nearly any problem. Defense Department was convinced that a whiff of grape shot was futile. Ours were the people who would get killed. They were the people who were going to pay for us to do the job that they thought could be done by the use of force, when we were convinced that it could not be done by the use of force. Unfortunately, as it turned out, we were right. But I think the problem has not disappeared. Finally, I would mention with regard to the Naval War College, the Blue Book series is, although distributed free to many American libraries, is not quite free to you all, but it's extremely cheap. I wrote a Blue Book when I was the Stockton Chair on the law of piracy. It sold out, and so there's a second edition now, which I won't back, but it's the Naval War College printed once. You buy it cheaply while it's available, and that's that. On to the subject of teaching of international law. It seems to me that when you get to humanitarian law, there are really a number of different normative orders that one must consider if you're going to teach the subject in a realistic way. If one speaks of the customary law of war, for example, one has to remember that the winners tend to be the ones who write the history. The customs in law, in war, in fact, are pretty horrible. The winners suppress the horrors and claim usually that they behave honorably throughout by their standards, and the fact is that they probably didn't. Customary law is therefore a very difficult one to rely on. Divine law, we see the result of applying divine law in the Middle East today, where everybody is convinced that God is telling him or her to destroy the enemy. This goes back to Deuteronomy, actually, where the Israelites were told, as a matter of divine law, to just kill everybody who was in the land. Those from a distant country who sued for peace to become hewers of wood and drawers of water. That was overcome by the actual experience of the re-entry. In the book of Joshua, you find that there were modifications made of this. In fact, there were peace treaties that were observed, and not everybody was killed, right starting from the invasion of Jericho, where the families, the two women who succored the Israeli spies, were in fact spared by agreement, even though the divine law said we should kill them. Divine law ultimately leads to Armageddon. There's two armies of the Lord, each fighting the other army, assuming that it's the army of the devil, until there's nobody left. It reminds me of an old Irish saying, there once were two cats at Kilkenny. Each thought there was one cat too many, so they fought and they fit, and they fought and they spit, until instead of two cats, there were any. A third area of humanitarian law that we have to bear in mind is the moral law. Some people think that moral law is law, properly so called, and for them it probably is. Certainly it was to Cicero. Whether it is to others is another question. After all, St. Thomas actually points out that the moral law is promulgated in the minds of each of us. But it's promulgated in the minds of each of us, what happens if your mind disagrees with somebody else's mind? Where do you get off telling the other person that your moral insight, your value judgment, is superior to somebody else's moral insight or value judgment? And the fact is that perfectly reasonable people do disagree regardless of what the French philosopher had to say in the 18th century. We do disagree deeply with each other about many important things, and the disagreements are obvious in the United States. Every 4 years we have a presidential election. Every 2 years we have congressional elections, and these moral
matters are subject to considerable discussion. This leads then, skipping over a number of other things, to the positive law. That is, the law that we agree on and consider binding because we agree on it. Now, why an agreement makes something binding is a matter, of course, of natural law, but we don't want to get into that. We'll just say that positive law has natural law roots, but Kelsen decided that that was not an interesting problem. We would simply discuss the positive law. There are conventions that deal with the laws of war, and Ivan has mentioned the Hague Convention and the Geneva Conventions, and Ted has mentioned the Geneva Protocols. So does Ivan. The important thing about the Hague Convention is, of course, that it doesn't distinguish between the jus ad bellum and the jus in bellum, the right to go to war and the right to end war. Once you're at war, these are the rules that you should follow. It doesn't matter whether your politicians made a mistake in entering the war, you are not responsible for these major activities. Others may handle that, in fact, in the UN General Assembly or the Security Council, or simply every state making up its own mind. There will be appropriate conclusions drawn. Let's leave aside the distinctions between jus ad bello and jus in bellum, except in one regard, and that is, in the Geneva Protocols of 1949, they tended to follow the Hague rules, saying we're concerned with the jus in bello rather than the jus ad bellum. And when the protocols were first considered, actually we set up a panel to discuss this in 1973. They eventually became concluded in 77. The American Society of International set up a panel. I was on it. The chairman was the vice chairman of the International Committee of the Red Cross, was Jacques Frémont, whom I remember extraordinarily fondly for one remark that he made to a fairly eminent member of the body who came in one day and said, "Why are we discussing this? It doesn't matter." And Jacques Frémont responded, "About twice a year I feel the same way." This is the vice chairman of the ICRC. Nobody really obeys the rules, but then I think to myself, what else can I do? I shrug my shoulders and go on to work. We, in the panel, recommended against what became the protocols, saying that the U.S. should not get involved in them if they dig deeper the distinction between so-called Article 2 and Article 3 conflicts, the internal armed conflicts and the armed conflicts of international character. Our recommendation was ignored at first. It then turned out, of course, that not only did the two protocols deepen the division, Protocol 1 focusing on Article 2 conflicts and Protocol 2 on Article 3 conflicts, but the U.S. then eventually said it could go along with one of the protocols but not the other, and never has submitted either, actually now for final, because we were right. We were right, but we were ignored, which is, as most of the members of the audience will know, is frequently the result of being right. On the other hand, you have to listen to the other side as well, because they may be right too, and the problems that everybody has to decide for themselves. One of the other problems that we had, and one that comes up in teaching the law of armed conflict, if you look at the positive law, is that the texts of the 1949 conventions are in fact highly defective from the point of view of trying to fix the law. For example, when they talk about grave breaches, on the basis of which we're trying to establish some people are trying to establish an international criminal court and set up other tribunals. For example, the movement of population is a grave breach, a serious war crime, if it's done contrary to law. But it doesn't say what body of law you look to. It's never contrary to the law of the party that's actually removing people. It's always contrary to law with regard to the party whose people you're removing. If you mean international law, what kind of a definition of that is that in a positive international law document that refers to itself and doesn't say what it means? There are other provisions. I won't go into detail on the armed conflict provision, the grave breaches provisions are the most notorious. But there are other provisions. For example, Article 2 says this applies to armed conflicts. Article 3 says an armed conflict not of an international character. What is an armed conflict? one of the parties, I think it was the UK, said, well, we'll decide what an armed conflict is. Sometimes there are simply sporadic raids and things of that sort that don't rise to the level of an armed conflict. I presume they had in mind Northern Ireland, where for about 600 years the British have regarded the affairs as a sporadic raid. I once had breakfast with Lord Chalfont once who said, they'll really suppress. He used to be the High Commissioner for Northern Ireland. So we have to make a war out of it. So we give prisoner of war treatment to the captured IRA types. He got very angry at that. And I said, well, or do you mean carry on the activities the British have been trying for 600 years now, 300 years since the William days, to apply in Northern Ireland? And has that brought peace? And do you think it's going to be peace now? Well, obviously he got even more angry at that. We did not have a very pleasant breakfast. The question of what is an armed conflict, what is an international character, a deeper question. Who is bound? If you read the conventions, you find the states were very careful to say we're not making law for individuals, we're making law for states. States are obliged to enact certain laws, to forbid certain activities. So what do you do if a state doesn't? Do you then try the members of the legislature that voted against this? You try the members of the executive branch who didn't propose the legislation you think they ought to have been bound to propose? The more you look at the conventions, the more you find that what they do is set out rules of what states ought to do, moral law rules, rather than what states are, as a matter of positive law, bound to do. Now, I must make another slight excursus and point out that this distinction between the moral law and the positive law was perceived at least 2,300 years ago by Aristotle, and it's always been subject to some amazement to me that people who were involved in the drafting of these conventions seem never to have read Aristotle or Pufendorf or Grotius or any of the other people who have made these distinctions extremely clearly. In fact, there's a major article by Sir Hersch Lauterbach, great scholars of international law, who talks of the Grotian view of international law. And at one point, he's read Grotius, obviously. At one point, he said he thought Grotius was joking. Grotius wasn't joking. Lauterbach simply didn't want people to read Grotius carefully. He wanted people to think that the Lauterbach view was the Grotian view, which it wasn't. It was a very different view, and not all as persuasive, I'm afraid, as the Grotian view, the true Grotian view, for those who have read Grotius. There are two other aspects that I will mention very briefly. One is that if the structure of the international legal order is to refer these matters then to the municipal law orders of the different countries, one has to decide whether one is referring to the criminal law order or the civil law order. The criminal law order will result in acquittals. After all, we did acquit O.J. Simpson, didn't we? There are levels of proof that are required. Mere newspaper stories are not enough. And proof has to be not by preponderance of the evidence, but beyond a reasonable doubt. If you start then convicting in the press, say Milosevic, who as far as I know may be a double-dyed villain, if you start convicting him in the press, and then he is acquitted in The Hague, what do you do then? Has anybody thought about the possibility, about the difficulties of proof? I hope that the trials now of the Libyans who presumably were involved in this, to the Lockerbie bombing, will awaken people to the fact that these are very serious problems, have been around for years. God knows, I've been writing about them for at least 10 years now. Nobody has apparently been prepared to pay much attention to the problems until now, when they're forced on people's attention. Another aspect of this was, for example, the Pinochet case. It seems to me that nobody is bothering to read Lord Slynn's dissent in the first House of Lords opinion, not to warn about the second House of Lords opinion and so on. But it seems to me that Lord Slynn was who was the chairman of the International Law Association, was one of the few people who knew anything about international law and wrote a very fine opinion on the case, saying that the UK should not extradite Pinochet. He ought to be tried in Chile if what the accusations say are correct. Certainly not in Spain. by a Spanish judge who rises from Spanish procedures and applies the Spanish version of international law to foreigners, but heaven forbid they should apply them to Franco's friends instead. Finally, there is the prospect of civil law trials, and every course on the International Law Board seems to me should take account of the possibility of civil law trials. And there one finds, again, two aspects. One is the spectacle of the Phil Artiga case, which I think is wrong historically in just about every sentence. And Anne-Marie Slaughter wrote an article in the American Journal of International Law where she doesn't take quite the same basis for criticism, but concludes that the case is totally wrong anyhow. Nonetheless, it's cited as a leading precedent, and nobody seems to care about the criticisms, except that the other cases that arise, the lawyers who are citing Phil Artiga as a leading precedent normally lose. Or if they win, as recently happened, they either collect no money at all, an empty judgment, or collect a huge amount of money, as it recently happened, and it turns out that the money comes from frozen bank accounts, which the Cubans or others who are going to lose the funds never thought they were going to get back anyhow. The funds are going to come out of the hands of other claimants against these pots of gold, and so it's Americans paying other Americans for these things, and they're claiming victory for international law. It seems to me a little bit strange. Finally, it seems to me there is substance to the laws of war, and that is in the natural law as initially proposed by Aristotle. If the word gets out that prisoners of war are routinely shot, then the persons who are tempted to surrender will not surrender. They say, we're going to be killed anyhow, we might as well take as many wicked enemies with us as we possibly can. This subject and other parts of the natural law certainly survive the consciousness of those who are focused on it, and became the subject, in fact, of a video tape which played extremely well back in the days before I was in the Naval War College. Must have been at least 10 years ago, where they had a group of U.S. Marines officers being questioned, and eventually they drive it down. It's like a war game. They drove it down to where the major says, in those circumstances, I would shoot my lieutenant rather than let my lieutenant carry on the activities that he's pursuing. I cited this when I was teaching the Law of War course at the Naval War College, and everybody was nodding. Yes, there are some circumstances where your own people go mad and begin to do to the enemy what they think the enemy has done to them, and that is not in the interest of, in this particular case, the United States, but it's not in the interest of any belligerent. In fact, the natural law applies whether we like it or not. The notion that you can ethnically cleanse an area, like Kosovo, and that the KLA will not react in kind is naive. The fact that the KLA also commits atrocities against Serbs is not accidental. It's an expression of the retaliatory justice in their minds, which civilized people will reject, but which they will not reject in the heat of the moment. There are many other examples of this, but I think we better just stop there.
Thank you very much, Professor Rubin. Professor Marin regrets that he has to leave now. He, in fact, is getting on a plane and going to Ottawa to give another speech this evening. He is given 2 presentations here already, and it's only almost 12 o'clock. He's off now to Ottawa, and I would just like to thank him very much for his presentation.
Thank you so much.
All right. I assure you this is not my usual average.
Good. Well, we've a little time left, and we can either have, I saw Professor Shearer making a few comments there on Professor Rubin's always provocative remarks, and either of the panelists would like to make any further comments. I think we could do that first, and then if there's any questions, we can move to that.
Well, no, I did make a comment for myself. I didn't quite understand what Professor Rubin said about the United States' reasons for not becoming a political party to Protocol 1, although it hasn't become a party to Protocol 2. But he may want to comment on that, but I think that really rather takes us away from the focus on teaching. I wonder whether perhaps somebody would like to lead off with some questions or observations about the teaching. Then we might perhaps get into the question that Professor Rubin raised.
Good. Well, I know this will be a provocative question because this is one of the members of the Rubber Group down in Virginia. So this is Kevin McCullum, who is also, I think, a reserve lieutenant colonel.
Let me first thank the panel for having straight about Valerie right away on the level of knowledge of the law of war and free discussion in the military. I'm only an alumnus by correspondence course from Newport, but I found, for example, when I attended the president course at Leavenworth, that there's more freedom of discussion than many civilian organizations I've been in. What perhaps misled Valerie was that she, not being in the military, she doesn't realize that JAG lawyers have such a lower status than combat arms officers. So that an infantry officer can argue with the commander when being talked back to him, the JAG officer can't. The JAG officers have to be much more careful about it. I can walk in and say, "Damn it, sir, you're going to get us all court-martialed." And talk to him, use language that the JAG officer can't. Okay, that aside, because she can't handle it. I found two problems in a course that we ran at a rival bar association here in New York. That I think would probably arise in any civilian forum. And the first problem is, if you're going to teach the law of war, how do you first teach the students the nature of war, about which they know very little, and probably what they know is erroneous from watching old movies? Most of us had a great deal of trouble with courses like the UCC in law school because we didn't understand the commerce that was regulated. In the summer program we ran, I had to give a 2-hour lecture on the nature of war that reminded me of what one of our lecturers said in Virginia. I don't remember who it was, Valerie, but he referred to his discussion as riding a bicycle through an art gallery. So how does the instructor take what should be really a whole semester in itself, just for an introduction, compress it somehow, and inform the students about the subject they're regulating? The second is, how do you deal with the changes and the explosion in the rules of war and related subjects, especially when we don't seem to proceed from a common basis of thinking in morality or policy or natural law that underlies them, but also because we don't know how long some of these rules are going to last, even when they appear in treaties. For example, about a year ago, I had an opportunity to take a job as a mercenary. Now, I passed it up, at least for the moment, but if I'm ever in a situation or I'm called back to active duty, I have no intention in the world of abiding by the landmine treaty. Now, being a lawyer, I know how to go about violating it, in that we want to set up a situation where the other side will violate it first, which we can certainly arrange. But even if these things go out of the inventory, we can recreate them. It was easier, we had C-rations because you could use the cans. But any sergeant worth his stripes is going to be able to figure this out. And my reaction will be, if anybody objects, I'm forcing the rule into desuetude. Now, the explosion in the body isn't always consistent, but more than that, it papers over through fundamental disagreements. Again, at this rival bar association this year on the Committee on Foreign and International Law, we were confronted with a resolution urging the association to declare that any use of nuclear weapons, even for deterrence or retaliation, is a violation of international law. And we discovered the real philosophical differences that came to the surface when people had to make a decision on the resolution. The most amusing part was probably that the supporters and the enemies of Israel lined up together to gang up against what they consider the pacifist and suicide section of the committee. So that's another problem. I think the philosophy, has to be addressed too, perhaps even before the rules. So how do you deal with the lack of knowledge of the students on the nature of war itself, and probably the lack of knowledge of the students on philosophy?
Can I just take up that the point about teaching the students the nature of warfare? I think it's a very good point, and if the students learn about war only from watching old movies, that's not a very good thing. Maybe Australian law students, I suspect, read more foreign news than do their American counterparts. But even so, it's not enough. I'm just reading a book at the moment called Virtual Warfare by Michael Ignatieff. He's a Canadian journalist. He recently wrote a very interesting biography of Sir Isaiah Berlin. But he was also responsible, I think this is the book of a 3-part television series made by the BBC called The Future of Warfare. And I only saw one of these. It's called Rules of Engagement. But I mean, for me, rules of engagement bring the law and the realities of warfare together. And this is where international law impacts. And this is where you implement international humanitarian law on conflicts through the promulgation of rules of engagement and their observation right down the line. And I'm trying to find a way of getting that particular one, the series, it may have been the last, was presented to a student audience at the London School of Economics in May this year, I understand. But I think the tape should be available. Anyway, it's called The Future of Warfare, and it may be available through the BBC website. But something like that, I think, is a very good, perhaps, introduction to such a course, that the students would look at those. And so on. Tempting though it is, I won't take up your wider topics because I think we'll see if we can exhaust the topic of teaching, of course.
Yeah. Again, very briefly, in my own course on the laws of war at Fletcher, I do try to introduce students to what is war by having them read a little bit of Clausewitz, where he dismisses the laws of war as not really worth worrying about, and then compare that with his with the actions of Bismarck after the Battle of Königsweg, where the Prussian forces pretty much eradicated the Austrian forces and then did not march on to Vienna, because that was not victory. That saddled them with a obligation to maintain some sort of order which they did not care to maintain, which they were unfit to maintain, and so on. The object of the war, therefore, was clearly in Bismarck's mind to destroy the capacity of Austria to stand in Prussia's way in various activities, but not to conquer Austria, which was in power. I wish that Americans had read this before, or the UN people had read this before engaging in the activities in Kosovo now, and realizing what victory would mean there, which I'm afraid they didn't, thus resulting in a peculiar American election. We had one candidate saying we should never have started, and the other one saying, I want to get out as soon as possible, but I don't know how. And American people simply believing those are the only two choices, which is absurd. With regard to the how do we deal with the proliferation of rules, it's very difficult. Our dean was Jack Galvin, who was a 4-star general, and he was against he favored the landlines protocol, the Ottawa Agreement. I'm rather against it, and I asked Jack at one time, what about the U.S.? He said, we can attend to other means, we can do all the appropriate things. I have my doubts. It seems to me that the natural result of ignoring the rules is in the natural law. You lose credibility, and people decide that your word is not worth very much, which makes life for you rather nasty, brutish, and expensive. You can't do by promises what other people might be able to do by promises. On the other hand, right now, the international community has so demeaned itself by futile promises, including, I'd say, both protocols and the various other documents. And most recently, I guess, how can Indonesia, which is involved in the East Timor, have possibly voted against the Israeli actions to suppress Palestinian rock-throwing kids? How could they conceivably have done this? It's not that the Israelis are right, but how could there have been this kind of vote by people? And the only answer I come up with is the one that Steve Schwabel and Eddie Hembrow came up with long ago, and that is people vote routinely for things in the UN General Assembly knowing that they're not binding as law. And in the Security Council, they vote for things expecting that they can veto the same things when they're being applied to themselves. But that's not law. It's not even morality. And I'm sorry that Ted is gone. But, so the answer is we're destroying or at least degrading the system by using it too much without enough for it, in my view.
I'll perhaps have another comment on Kevin's question. The issue that you raise, the first issue, which is how do you teach the laws of war when the students know nothing about the nature of warfare, and you quite rightly alluded to the fact that this is very often a problem throughout law school courses, whether it's UCC or landlord-tenant or whatever it might be. And of course that raises a very fundamental philosophical issue in the teaching of law, whether you do it with the practicum added to it or as some integral part of it, or whether you don't. I'm not suggesting that we therefore send students to war, but of course you have law schools like Northeastern Law School in Boston that have come at the teaching of law in a quite different way from most of the law schools, and they insist as part of their instructional program that students spend, I think it's 6 months in the classroom, then they spend 6 months in practice, then they spend 6 months in the classroom and 6 months in practice, to overcome, to some extent, of course, the problem that you raised. But let me just say this. One of the things that one always finds when warfare is under discussion in whatever fashion is that those who have been in the military and or taken part in warfare tend to use the argument, you cannot possibly understand what I am talking about because you haven't been there and you've not been involved in it, and therefore to discredit anyone, and that was a very common argument during the Vietnam War, for example. If you haven't been there, you wouldn't do that. All of us know to some extent that in life, as in war, if we have not walked in the shoes of someone, we don't fully appreciate the issue. But I think it is a mistake to say that without understanding or being familiar with the actual day-to-day conflict, that we cannot then, therefore, fully appreciate the law. You may appreciate it in a slightly different way, it's perfectly true, and it may bring you a different aspect if you have been there. But I don't think that it is necessary actually to either participate in or understand the nature of warfare, at least on the ground notion of the warfare. Although I agree with Professor Shearer, and I think you too, that there is this question of credibility.
Obviously, you don't actually have to be in the service, or Julian Corbett wouldn't have displaced Admiral Mahan at Newport. But you have to have studied the subject.
All right. The other point I want to make on this, however, is from a sort of feminist perspective, too. Yes. Right. And I do it from this point of view. Of course, the feminist critique of the laws of war are, in general, that they have been made up by men, for men, because, of course, throughout history, by and large, wars have been fought by men. And only very latterly, and only in a few instances, yes, there are Amazonian wars, and so forth and so on, so forth and so on. But of course, the feminists have begun an area of scholarship in the laws of war to look at, say, for example, the Geneva Convention and Protocols, to talk about what it is they've missed with respect to women's experience in war. And of course, I think this has become particularly significant now, as Professor Barron mentioned, and as we all know. International wars are very much on the decline, and civil wars are on the uprise. And of course, the number of civilians killed in warfare at the turn of the century, it used to be 90% military were killed and 10% civilian, and now it's 90% civilian and 10% military. So that women's experience of law lining up against each other and smashing each other, and sometimes people coming out to watch it, to engulfing the whole of civil society has changed very much indeed. And of course the two tribunals that are now up and running, Rwanda and Yugoslavia, have begun to address some of these questions when they have looked, for example, at the question of rape as a violation of laws of war. But this is a much bigger discussion. All that I'm saying is not that I necessarily disagree with you, but I think you have to be careful about what you insist people are instructed in before they can be allowed to look at this other document. Because I think what you bring with you in saying that is a certain amount of baggage about who's allowed into this little elite group that can know about this. Okay, a longer answer than perhaps it should. Yes.
Yes. Sorry, I have an unpronounceable name for English speakers. My name is Bertrand, I think it's the easiest. I am a legal advisor for the International Committee of the Red Cross. And speaking of experience with me, I had the privilege to have been speaking both to Bosnian Serb paramilitaries, to Interahamwe militias, to Myanmar government or Sri Lankan LTTE, but also did some lecture in Sanremo courses, or recently in Williamtown in December for the ASEAN summit of heads of training of military armies. So I think with this baggage, I think we can only welcome that both military but also civilians have an interest into the law of armed conflict, and that this interest is, of course, of different nature. And I am a bit surprised by the comment that I heard just before on the right or legitimacy of retaliation. You spoke about anti-personal landmarks. Well, let's push the reasoning on rape. If the other side rapes, am I main rape? If the other side commits genocide, could I do it too? And if we push this too far, I think the main interest of the military on respecting the law of armed conflict is on maintaining discipline within their own troops, so that your men, and maybe it's part of natural law, do not obey to their basic instincts, but maybe respect fundamental principles and fundamental law of armed conflict. Now, for civilians to have an interaction with the military, I think it is very important, because also they, even though they do not know what war is all about, but should you know what torture is about before being able to speak about torture? I'm not that sure. You can understand notions and at least be interested into them before experiencing them yourself, even though, of course, you are more in a position to speak about them once you live through them. But civilians, and I think that's very important too, should learn from military academies and from military people. And I don't know exactly to which extent there can be an inter-exchange between academic institutions and military. And for this, I would take the example of the Australian Army that recently produced a CD-ROM on international humanitarian law with Michael Kelly, who was very much involved into that. And I know it's for the Australian military. Now, to which extent could it be also passed on to other circles? Because military in every single country has big budgets, they have big means, they can produce tremendous teaching materials. And that would be a question to Ivan Shearer. To which extent do you think it would be possible for some militaries to share their experience and to share their material they produce to civilian academies? And again, I would say a big thank to the panel, and to say again and state again that ICRC is more than happy to help you when you build these courses as academicians, to help you in providing some material existing within. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, now, I think it's time actually to finish up the panel, because some of us here at least have to run off to yet another meeting. And consequently, it remains for me simply to thank Professor Shearer and